Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Laura Boycourt. Today, we're discussing the importance of sleep, and joining us is Dr. Melody Hawkins, who specializes in pediatrics, pediatric pulmonology, and sleep medicine at the Inova Children's Sleep Center in Fairfax, Virginia. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So let's jump right in. First and foremost, it would be great if you could tell the listeners and viewers what it is you do at the Sleep Center, maybe the ages of the patients you work with, just what an average day might look like for you.
Got it. Yeah. So we have a pediatric sleep clinic where we see patients in clinic and they can come in or be seen virtually sometimes as well. And then we also have a dedicated pediatric sleep lab where basically children come into the sleep lab for an overnight sleep study. And we mostly do in labs in the, or sorry, sleep studies in the lab for children, whereas for adults, they tend to do more home sleep studies. But that has been found to be not very accurate for children. And then it's also very difficult to get children to wear the sensors all night.
Right.
That's another just kind of practical problem. But as far as the ages that we see, it's pretty much from birth to 21 years of age.
Okay. All right. And a little bit about your background, if you don't mind, just sort of what experience you've had, what brought you to this, just out of curiosity.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm from Louisiana and did a lot of my training there. And then I did my subspecialty fellowship training in pediatric pulmonary and sleep medicine at Yale. Those are two different fellowships, but they complement each other very well. And then I ended up moving to Northern Virginia after my training. And I've really enjoyed it. And I've been doing mostly sleep medicine and some pediatric pulmonary since then.
Wow. So I'm guessing you've seen a lot, and you'll be a great resource for this. So I'm so glad we get to have this opportunity to talk. So shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to get into the nuts and bolts and sort of focus just in the beginning on some data from the CDC, specifically the CDC's recommendations about how much sleep kids should be getting. And I'll ask you if these recommendations seem in line with what you're seeing. For ages 6 to 12, the recommendation is about 9 to 12 hours of sleep per night. For teens, 13 to 18, they need about 8 to 10 hours. And the CDC also reports that roughly 6 in 10 middle schoolers and 7 in 10 high schoolers don't get the recommended amount of sleep. Do those sound in line with the data on your end? And have you noticed this lack of sleep in your
Yes. So
experience?
as far as the data, I would say I do agree with those general parameters. I would mention that as far as how much sleep a person needs in order to feel well rested and refreshed, that tends to be quite variable. And so generally, if you're waking up feeling well rested and good to go, then you're probably getting enough sleep. And so you might not want to worry about it if your child's a little bit on the lower end of normal. That doesn't necessarily need to mean that they need to be at the top end of normal to be getting good sleep. They might not need that much sleep. So that's why there tends to be a range, just because of that general variability. As far as, kids being sleep deprived, yes, I would say that that's at least true from what they're reporting. A lot of the children that we see are quite sleep deprived, and that's a major issue.
Okay, and then that's a perfect segue into the reasons behind the lack of sleep. And I would imagine, just as someone who is not in the midst of this, I am a parent, so I know our personal reasons for lack of sleep. But I would have to assume it can be attributed to sleep disorders, technology, homework, things like that. So it'd be great if you could comment on any or all of those, and
Sure.
additional ones as well.
Sure. So I would say definitely all of those. So, rigorous school with lots of homework tends to be a problem, especially for some of the kind of older teenagers. And we'll get into other reasons that older teenagers have additional sleep problems, which largely involves problems with their circadian rhythm or circadian rhythm dysfunctions, can even worsen that problem. And as far as, younger kids, a lot of, tech
Mhm.
issues and limit settings are a big problem. I see a lot of children that are very preoccupied with, tech type devices.
Mhm.
And so that's a big challenge for parents and families in general. Light exposure is another big one. We're just kind of not very well adapted to being exposed to bright light in the evening. And so that does affect our ability to be able to fall asleep and get good quality, restful sleep.
Okay. And then sleep disorders. I know that's something that that you and I have worked on in the past for some research and things. Could you comment on those? What types of sleep disorders do you see? What are maybe the most common?
Sure. So, one of the most common, I would say, is what we call sleep disordered breathing. And that kind of runs the spectrum from snoring, because we feel like snoring in children is not really thought to be normal. And that can have impacts on the quality of your sleep. And if that is also associated sometimes with what we call obstructive sleep apnea, which is pretty common, I would say. About 1 to 3% of children have sleep apnea per a lot of the more recent studies. In younger children, that a lot of times is associated with having enlarged tonsils or adenoids. And so having that evaluated can be helpful, because it can sometimes be not necessarily easy solution, but compared to more kind of long-term therapies, it can be a faster solution, especially as it can cause, kind of ADHD type symptoms like emotional regulation issues, mood problems, mood swings, hyperactivity, those sorts of things. And then that can also happen in older children as well, and teenagers. Sometimes it tends to be more weight related or other things like a genetic predisposition because of anatomical features. We also deal with issues like restless leg syndrome or other movement
Mhm.
disorders during sleep, which very often can be associated with having low iron levels. And so, again, that can sometimes be a relatively easy fix. I'll also mention that vitamin D deficiency is very common and can be associated with insomnia and other causes of sleep disturbances. We also see patients for what we call hypersomnia, or sleeping too much or being more sleepy than you should be. Narcolepsy is a more fairly rare issue,
Mhm.
but still something to consider and can be seen. And then definitely one of the more common is what we call circadian dysfunction, or not sleeping at the right times.
Okay, and just talking about that, I guess, and I'm guessing it, varies by age. But what are some of the causes? It's the bright light. That's just those habits keeping children up later, sort of just not falling in line with what our bodies are expected to do, or what they feel most comfortable doing.
Sure. So one of the more common um, symptoms of circadian dysfunction or diagnoses is what we call delayed sleep phase syndrome. And that's more prevalent in older teenagers, as we have that kind of natural circadian shift back in when we sleep. You think about your typical 5-year-old might go to bed at 8 p.m., but your typical 18-year-old is just not going to be able to fall asleep at 8 p.m. And that's perfectly normal and natural. And that's part of why the early school start times can be so problematic in these older children. So I would say that the delayed sleep phase syndrome can be contributed by many different things, but one of the main ones is having bright light exposure at
Mm,
night,
okay.
not getting enough light exposure in the morning, irregular meal, as some of these kids are eating at night, and
Mm,
that's basically a sign to your body to be awake and that it's daytime. And a lot of people don't realize that. And then also being active during the day is another thing that can help with that. And a lot of our children are not being active during the day.
okay, so more activity to give your body the cue, when
Yes.
it's time to be up versus when it's not. And then on the subject of the meals, which is really interesting, and obviously I'm guilty, have been guilty of having a late night snack, and I have found
Mhm.
that I stay up later as a result of that. What how well, how to phrase it? how early would you say kids, adults, anyone should sort of wrap up the eating before getting into that nighttime routine to help them fall asleep when they should?
So in general, I would say if you want to be sleeping, you shouldn't be eating.
Mm,
So let's say that you want to be going to sleep by 10 p.m. I wouldn't be eating after 9:30 for sure.
okay. Okay.
And in addition to that, it's also what you eat that could be important. So you don't want to be hungry when you're going to bed because sometimes that can cause you problems with falling asleep. So some, especially kind of, younger children do like a little bit of a bedtime snack, and that's fine. Even like 2 hours before bed, an hour and a half, that's probably okay. I would make sure that it's something kind of easy to digest and not super processed, because
Okay.
those processed foods, very high fat, very high sugar, take a little bit more time to digest. And so then what's happening is when you fall asleep, your body should be working on all of the more restorative functions that your body does to while it's sleeping. But instead, it's working on digesting the food that you just ate. And that's what we don't want. There's also some thought that when you're sleeping, your body is kind of clearing out your brain. There's something called lymphatic flow,
Mm,
which is basically where you're getting rid of some of the more negative proteins and things like that in your brain. And that happens more during deep sleep. And so we want to optimize everything that we can to try to ensure that we're getting as much deep sleep as possible for a
mhm.
lot of different reasons. Also in children, that's when you secrete growth hormones. So it helps to support normal, healthy growth as well.
Okay. So the lack of adequate sleep really can impact a child in all the ways, and that's something that I want to jump into if that's where we're headed next. The dangers of not getting enough sleep, the
Yeah.
cognitive, the emotional, the physical. So if you could just sort of touch on all of those if you're able.
Sure. So to start with physical, I would say impaired growth is one.
Mm,
Another one is disordered appetite regulation. So when you don't get enough sleep, it basically alters your hormones like leptin and ghrelin, which ghrelin is one of the hormones that makes you hungry, and it can increase levels of that. It's also been shown that having insufficient sleep increases your chance of what we call having hedonic eating, basically meaning it's going to make you crave more like cookies, chips, cake, and
mm,
not the apple,
mhm,
kind of more
mhm,
healthy
mhm.
foods. And that's actually been shown in some really interesting medical studies where they sleep deprived people and then, like usually medical students, and then they
Yeah.
basically give them free access to food and see what they choose. Um,
Wow.
so I would say for appetite regulation, getting good sleep can definitely help with that, can also help to maintain normal body weight just from other mechanisms as well of fat catabolism, that sort of thing, promoting, proper balance of like body composition with muscle
Mm,
mass, fat. So sleep helps with all of those. So that would be a lot of the physical things. Mentally, of course, sleep disruption or sleep deprivation causes impairment with your thinking and concentration. So also it's going to cause you to not only be less focused during the day, but also during sleep, especially REM sleep is where we're formulating a lot of our learning, and
mhm,
we're creating new memories, and so we're basically processing all of the things that we learned that day. So I would not recommend pulling an all-nighter before test, because that
mhm,
has profound consequences, not just on focus but also on consolidating everything that you were trying
mhm.
to learn the day before. Of course,
Okay.
mood, a lot of very intimate relationships between sleep and mood issues. And it can even cause increased risk of things like anxiety and depression, because you're having so much more emotional dysregulation, and, mood swings, that sort of thing.
Mhm. Okay. And this spans all of the ages, right? I mean, from preschoolers to adults. I would guess the impacts, are more pronounced, certain ages, but it really can touch everyone. Is that right?
For sure. Definitely there's that thought that in the younger kind of school age children, it can cause more ADHD type symptoms.
Okay.
And a lot of that is because in that kind of, let's say, 6 to 9 age range, that's when you're about as awake as you're ever going to be, just physiologically. And
Mhm.
so, if children like that are generally sleep deprivation doesn't cause them to be sleepy, it causes them to be hyper. But if you have a child that age that is sleepy, that's not normal. And that's probably a sign that you might want to look into things.
Okay. And just sort of piggybacking on that comment you just made about the tie to ADHD. I know, generally speaking, in more recent years, there's been an increase in ADHD diagnoses. Can some of that be attributable to the lack of sleep and sort of the increase of lack of sleep to technology and all of these things, perhaps?
That's a little bit more difficult to say. I
Yeah.
definitely would say that one, sleep deprivation or like medical causes for sleep
Hmm.
disruption or poor quality sleep can cause ADHD like symptoms.
Hmm.
But then on the flip side of that, ADHD is associated with a lot of sleep problems on its own. So
Okay.
definitely know that children that have ADHD tend to have problems falling asleep and staying asleep.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. So covering all of the dangers, the downsides of not having enough sleep, what are some things that parents, individuals, anybody, what are things that people can do to try to get the sleep that they need, especially kids, if you can comment? I'm sure we have a lot of, caregivers listening that might be looking for some helpful tips.
Sure. So, one of the best things that you can do, also for me at least, one of the
Hmm.
hardest things to do is to have a consistent sleep schedule. If you try to go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time every day, it's going to help prevent those kind of swings in your sleep schedule that are not optimal and basically, set you up for not being successful.
Hmm.
If you sleep until, let's say, noon on Sunday, we don't have a prayer of falling asleep by 10 p.m. Sunday night. And then you're just basically, set up, the week for not having a great week, because there's two different, basically, what we call causes of your sleep drive. One is your homeostatic sleep drive, meaning that the longer that you're awake, the more you are going to accumulate a neurotransmitter in your brain called adenosine, which is what makes you sleepy. This is also the
Okay.
neurotransmitter that caffeine works on. This is why a lot of
Ah,
people drink caffeine, to make them feel more awake and alert.
right.
So there's that. So you need to have a certain amount of time awake before you're sleepy enough to fall asleep again. And then the other thing that regulates that is your circadian rhythm. So if you start, kind of messing with that to a big degree and your sleep schedule is very variable, then it makes it harder to get good quality sleep. So going to bed and waking up at the same time every day and not having like super late sleep in on the weekends is definitely one of the things that can help. The other thing I would say is having regular meals, getting adequate exercise and activity during the day, and getting adequate sunlight exposure, especially in the morning, which can help wake you up and actually set your circadian rhythm so that you are able to fall asleep more easily that night. And then
Okay.
also avoiding especially bright overhead lights, kind of leading up, I'd say, an hour or so before your bedtime.
Okay, great recommendations. When to shut off technology? What time
Yeah.
is good
So
to do that? I know we're all guilty of sitting there scrolling on our phones, in the dark. And for kids, of a certain age, that might be true. Little ones, maybe not so much, but when should we shut off that TV? When should we put the phone down?
my general thought would be ideally at least an hour before you want to go to sleep. Because there is that thought of, the blue light and that sort
Mhm.
of thing affecting your sleep stages, and that is true. So it not only affects your ability to fall asleep, but also the quality of the sleep that you're getting once you do go to sleep. So it can affect your what's called your sleep architecture, or the way that you cycle through your sleep stages, and it could decrease the amount of deep or more restorative sleep stages that you're getting. So even though maybe you slept the same amount, it wasn't as good of quality as it could have been if you're, looking at your
Mhm.
phone or tablet for 3, 4 hours right before bed.
Sure, that makes sense. And then the last thing I was hoping to pick your brain about while we have you is the hot topic of school start times. And a recent meta-analysis by the American Academy of Pediatrics, quote, later SSTs, that school start times, are associated with better overall developmental outcomes, longer sleep duration, and less negative mood, end quote. And just building on that, a 2014 study found negative impacts of starting school before 8:30 a.m. So I was wondering what your opinion is on school start times.
Yeah, so this is definitely a hot topic, especially among sleep doctors. So most sleep doctors were pretty impressed by this data, and I was as well. Especially, I would say the data on the reduction in teenage driving accidents with later
Okay.
sleep school start times was
Mhm.
pretty impressive. It was a very dramatic difference. So
Mhm.
that's definitely one thing to take into account. I do want to mention that this is more pertinent for our teenagers.
Right.
And so this isn't really necessarily across the board or apply the same for like elementary
Mhm.
schools. So this is really more for our older kids. And that's because of that kind of natural circadian rhythm issue that
Mhm.
we talked about earlier.
Okay, great. And any parting words or advice for families in terms of their sleep health? Any last bits of advice for things they should or should not be doing?
Sure. So I would say for younger kids, limit setting is one of the more challenging issues,
Mhm. Mhm.
but definitely has a big part to play. And so establishing kind of good habits from the start, I think is very helpful of, this is what we do every night. There's no need to
Mhm.
argue or push back because it's going to be the same thing every single night. I think that that can be helpful, and also just kind of put in place good habits for as kids get older and you have less control on what they're doing,
Mhm.
and also just trying to establish that respect of what sleep does for you and the negative consequences of not getting enough sleep, because I do see a lot of children that have this perception that sleep is not important or not
Mhm.
useful. And, as you get older, you learn some of these things, but it would be nice if, younger kids
Mhm.
didn't have that
Mhm.
outlook or really understood the importance of getting good quality sleep. So I would say just making sure that they think that it is important and explaining why could also be helpful, and just establishing those good habits kind of from the beginning so that that's a routine. I would also
I
say that,
I hadn't thought about that, having that discussion. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. Not letting kids get completely off of their sleep cycle on like
Mhm.
vacations and summers is also a good idea, because some kids very quickly will become completely nocturnal pretty much
Mhm.
every summer. And that has a lot of negative effects overall. Not just do they have to transition back once school starts, but we know from looking at shift work that sleep at night is much more restorative and beneficial than sleeping during the day. So, sleeping during the day for that same 8 hours is not going to give you the same benefit of sleeping at night.
Mhm.
And we know this from looking at shift workers that they have increased rates of cancer, mood disorders, obesity, basically everything you don't want.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, so that would be one other thing that I would counsel parents about, is trying to at least limit some of that. I'm not saying you have to still get up at 7 a.m.,
Right.
for the
Yeah.
whole summer, but kind of, not taking it to the extreme.
Sure. Fantastic recommendation. And it seems like with my daughters, we're going to have that conversation about the importance of sleep, which, it makes perfect sense. So thanks for bringing that up. I've got some work to do. Thank you so much to Dr. Melody Hawkins of the Inova Children's Sleep Center for being here with us today. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Laura Boycourt with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thanks so much for joining us.